Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our final Religious Studies Forum for this semester. My name is Hansian Liu. I'm an assistant professor of religious studies working on Islam at the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies here at Arizona State University. And I will be moderating today's forum with my colleague right here, Professor Leah Sarat. So with that said, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Susannah Crockford to our forum. Dr. Crockford is an anthropologist specializing in religion, ecology, and political economy. She obtained her PhD in anthropology from the London School of Economics and Political Science and has completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Ghent University in Belgium. She has published articles in journals such as Pomegranate, the International Journal of Pagan Studies, as well as Religion, State, and Society. Her first monograph, titled Ripples of the Universe, Spirituality in Sedona, Arizona, will be published under the Class 200 list of the University of Chicago Press. And in fact, it's coming out very soon, just next month in May. Her talk today is titled Reading Ripples, Seeking Sedona, Cosmologies, Conspiracies, and Spirituality in Northern Arizona. So Dr. Crockford, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that kind welcome and for inviting me here. I'm going to share my screen now, if this works. Let's see. So you can all see some pretty pictures of Sedona, which I know everyone likes. Oh. There we go. I got it. All right, the system works. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today about my book, Ripples of the Universe, which is based on my thesis, which was called After the American Dream. And it's based on roughly 2 years fieldwork in Sedona, Arizona. However, I have been back to Sedona pretty much every year for periods between 2 months to 6 months since I left the field in 2014. So I've got long-term ethnographic engagement in the area since I left the field officially in 2014. And I do now live in Flagstaff, and I have for the last year. And since you're all mostly going to be based in Arizona, I'm probably going to skip much of the context that I would normally do and kind of just dive straight into the argument of the book itself and kind of just go through some of the kind of key themes and what's going on. And then I'll end up and I'll try and leave lots of room for questions. So yeah, on the left of the screen, you can see this is the cover of the book, and I want to point out something cool. So the cover was done by the publisher, but they actually have a view from the top of the rock, which is one of the vortexes in Sedona. That's actually a key point in like chapter 2. So I'm really happy with this cover image. I thought it was a nice synchronicity. Okay. So I went to Sedona because I wanted to study basically like what is New Age spirituality in contemporary America. Sedona is known as this kind of place with a lot of New Age activity. There are stores that are called things like Center for the New Age, and there are these rocks that are called vortexes. So it seemed like a good place to do an empirical ethnographic study of New Age spirituality. One of my kind of key ideas going in was to really kind of challenge this idea of the New Age, or the New Age movement, as it's called in a lot of the existing literature, especially the literature that was around then when I went to the field, which is 2012. And I felt like there was something missing from this literature, that often when New Age spirituality is talked about, it's kind of not defined with any kind of rigor. Instead, you would get, so for example, one famous book by Steve Sutcliffe, Children of the New Age, would said that the New Age is defined by its non-formativeness. Another by Olav Hammer, his book Claiming Knowledge, just kind of listed a whole kind of range of practices associated with the New Age as his definition. So, New Age is astrology, it's tarot, it's yoga. And I felt like this was essentially akin to defining Christianity by prayer. Yes, Christians pray, but so do lots of other people, right? Lots of other people do yoga. That doesn't necessarily mean you're implicated in New Age spirituality. And so that was kind of my approach going in. And when I got to the field, I discovered another problem, which is that no one at all really used the phrase the New Age. No one wanted to be called a New Ager. Like, yeah, it was on one of the stores or one or two of the stores, but no one would go around saying it or talking about it. Instead, what they talked about was spirituality, just that on its own, no modifier, spirituality. So I tried to, through the course of my fieldwork, figure out how to theorize spirituality. And I came up with an argument that is in the book that's kind of based on 4 points of how you might want to define spirituality, which hopefully, yes. Okay, and I talk about it in terms of cosmologies, and I'm going to come around in a minute to why I chose the word cosmology there. But so kind of to get to the definition I use, and this is in the introduction of the book. So the first point is that the central idiom, the central organizing concept of spirituality is this concept of energy. The energy has a pivotal place conceptually in the way that people talk about, but also enact and embody what they call their spiritual paths. So an energy is an all-pervasive force, right? Everything is energy. And energy vibrates at a certain frequency. So these three words come up a lot in talk about spirituality: energy, frequency, and vibration. And often they're sort of used interchangeably. But I think that there are subtle differences in the way that they are kind of formulated, in that, so everything is energy, right? Energy has a vibration, and that vibration has a certain frequency. And basically, when you perceive mass, at least in the kind of cosmologies of spirituality, what they think of mass or solid states is in fact energy vibrating at such a kind of rapid frequency that it takes the appearance of mass, but mass is in fact an illusion. And what this kind of energy constitutes is something called the universe. Again, the universe is everything. Energy emanates out from the universe in ripples, hence the title of the book. And the universe is kind of a pantheistic conception of divinity. So people would talk about the universe wants you to have this. The universe told me to go there. So it's kind of given this kind of agentive force, but in fact, the universe doesn't really want or do anything as such. The universe simply is. And energy ripples out, creating the universe. And you, as part of that, are in fact part of the universe. There's this principle of oneness. We're all part of the same energy. We're all part of the same universe. However, here in the dimension that we're in, the one with mass, which is an illusion, there's a perception that we are separate from the universe. And this is kind of like the central, like almost theological problem in spirituality that I found, that we experience our existence in the third dimension, as they call it, as separate from the universe. And we're aiming to reunite with the universe, which is also sometimes called source or spirit. Sometimes people just use the term God. So the way you kind of reunify with the universe is through your spiritual path. Now, your spiritual path can be anything. And this is the progressive stages of enlightenment described as a spiritual path that I have on the text there. So you can do whatever it is that you feel you need to do to raise your vibration. And as your vibration raises, you get closer to reunifying with the universe, to reattaining this sense of oneness. And that's also kind of called enlightenment. Sometimes words used from other religions that mean something akin to enlightenment are used. And this is where things like yoga and astrology and tarot come in. Because your spiritual path can be anything, right? You can constitute it whatever way you want it to be. So they kind of talk in terms of like, you kind of have to feel like what resonates with you. So if you want to do yoga all day as your spiritual path, then that's great. If you want to be a psychic reader, for example, then you can do that. There's no right or wrong way to tell anyone how to do their spiritual path in spirituality. And this leads to a lot of what we call cultural appropriation, because, and also just appropriation of historical traditions as well. So they would commonly adopt, for example, a very common one is Native American practices. For example, people would like to do sweat lodges. But they also really like Tibetan Buddhism. There's a lot of Buddhist iconography and spirituality. They also like to talk about ancient Egypt. So a lot of people would tell me they were like the reincarnated soul of the sun god Ra. And reincarnation is part of the spiritual path, right? So you live your one life trying to ascend as much as you can. And then when you die, you incarnate into another body, another corporeal form, or you might incarnate on another dimension, right? Or you might be an alien. Aliens are also part of this cosmology. They're just different vibrations of energy in different dimensions. And that's why the more spiritually elevated can see them. So yeah, you can basically say whatever you want for your spiritual path, but there are some certain conventional ways that their people in Sedona would constitute their spiritual path. So even though theoretically it could be anything, I never met anyone using, for example, Islamic theology or practices. I never met anyone using, say, Australian Aboriginal practices, but you know, it was the ones that they had a lot of access to through their sources and the ones that were popular in their kind of local communities and the things that they would read online especially. So they were kind of conventional ways that spiritual paths were constructed, even though theoretically it could be anything. So, and then what these spiritual paths, everyone doing their own personal kind of path to enlightenment amounts to is something called Ascension. And this is the millenarian belief in a new paradigm replacing the old paradigm. The term New Age comes from astrology and the Theosophical Society, the work of Annie Besant. And it used to be this idea of the changing from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. It was also in the musical Hair. And that idea is kind of developed now. And these days in Sedona, I find most people will actually use the term new paradigm rather than new age. But it's this sense of total transformation of the world that we live in. And it involves a number of things that will change. For example, our relationship to nature will change. It will no longer be extractive. We'll live in harmony with nature. There will be an end to the current financial system that they see as a very low vibration. Pretty much anything to do with making a lot of money, they see as a very low vibration. So all these things that was associated as low vibrational, as being of the third dimension that have a dense form of energy, these were all associated with the old paradigm, and that's what would end when the ascension occurs, elevating all of us individually, but also the whole planet, which is generally referred to as Gaia, to a higher dimension, most often called the fifth dimension. In the fifth dimension, other things will be possible, will be telepathic, there'll be no money problems. So it's kind of like this kind of golden age idea. This is a classic millenarian idea that, you know, everything we don't like about this current era ends and we get this new kind of shiny era where everything according to the beliefs that the people who hold this idea come true. So that's kind of how I define spirituality. But in the book, I kind of go further than just making a description of spirituality and trying to theorize it in this way. What I try and talk about is how this sounds like a radical idea, right? You know, they're basically saying capitalism ends, you know, extraction ends, you know, all these things that are damaging to our health and our planet and our society, these things are all going to end. So it's kind of a revolutionary idea. Yet people in Sedona are not very radical or revolutionary at all, in my experience. They're almost anti-political. They didn't think politics was worth getting involved in. That would lower your vibration. Like even kind of saying that you would vote, that was far too kind of third dimensional for most of them. So they had this kind of anti-politics stance that really kind of undermined the revolutionary message or the implication rather of their beliefs. And instead they all tended to just stay very much on their own, in their own spiritual path, doing their own thing, rather than collectivizing to make any of these things actually happen in the social level. So in the book, what I theorize this as is an inability to think on middle scales. They go straight from the individual, my personal spiritual path, to the cosmological. What I do affects the fate of the planet and in fact the whole universe, right? But they miss out a middle level, so it kind of skips. And I use the analytic of the portal in the book to describe this skip. And this is apposite for a number of reasons, because they also think portals exist and you can go through them at any time. And I'm going to talk about someone in a moment who did in fact think he would get through a portal. So that's the kind of central argument to the book, that in a sense that this is a denial of structural causes and indeed structural violence, that instead of kind of perceiving the causes of the things that they are critiquing, they kind of invert their view to themselves and instead become very self-focused on like, what is my personal spiritual path? Like, how do I constitute myself, without ever really questioning what is myself and how is that self in relation to other people in society? That social level is almost entirely evacuated. So, in terms of how these spiritual paths work in practice, a lot of it is kind of oriented around this idea that Sedona is a sacred place. And many of you may have come across, living in Arizona, these ideas that Sedona is sacred, that there's something special about it, or maybe perhaps that there's lots of woo-woo there. So woo-woo is like the negative term that people who weren't involved in spirituality in Sedona used for the people who were involved in spirituality. And the idea that Sedona is a sacred and special place is very much connected to its specific landscape. It's an example of nature religion, what Catherine Albanese called nature religion in her 2002 book of the same name. So this is Cathedral Rock, again, a very familiar site in Arizona. This is one of the 4 main vortexes. There are 3 others: Bell Rock, Boynton Canyon, and Airport Mesa. However, when you talk to people in Sedona, there are not 4. The whole area is a vortex. And in fact, the idea that there are 4 is just something that is used to tell tourists so that they can find the vortexes when they come visit. Now, Sedona is a very small town in terms of its permanent population. There's 10,000 people in Sedona and 7,000 people in the village of Oak Creek, but there are roughly 3 million visitors per year to Sedona. The main part of the economy is tourism. So there are a lot of people who come to see the vortexes in particular, and at a certain point, there are conflicting stories as to how it happened. They kind of decided that there were 4 vortexes and that they would take people on tours to see them. But it's kind of like this inner out of knowledge thing when you talk to people who actually live there and have moved there to follow their spiritual path. They say, yes, you know, people will come and they'll go on their tours to see the vortexes, but that's not it, right? The real vortex is the whole area. And they say that it's an energy that comes from the land. And this is this idea of ley lines, which is that there are lines of energy crisscrossing the earth, and there are intersections of these ley lines. And at those intersections, you get vortexes. They do say vortexes and never vortices, by the way. So it's something that's meant to be inherent in the earth, right? The sacrality of Sedona comes from the earth itself. And people would often say that because it comes from the earth itself, it was known to, as they would just generically say, the Native Americans. And they would attribute the sacredness of Sedona to the local tribes, and the people who lived in Sedona would say that it was sacred to the Native Americans, but they never lived there because it was their church. Someone said to me that, you know, you don't live in your church. So Sedona was meant to be this place that was so holy and sacred. The energy was so intense that you were only really meant to go there for ceremony rather than live there full time. And this kind of sentiment would often echo through people's personal stories as well. They would say, you know, the energy of Sedona just got too intense for me, so I had to leave. And people would say to me, you know, Sedona, the energy will spit you up and chew you out if it doesn't want you to be here. And if it wants you to be here, then you can stay. But the idea that the local Native American tribes did not live here is false. The Yavapai, it's Yavapai land, and they were forced to leave at the end of the 19th century. They called it Wipuk, which is the middle world, which is where the first humans emerged. So this idea that the vortexes are Native American, however they vaguely constitute that, is really a colonial erasure of the removal of the original peoples of this area and a way of reclaiming it for the current white inhabitants. Now, the way people kind of enact this in their own practice, some are more problematic than others. I think some of my interlocutors were quite well-meaning. For example, I had one who I describe in the book. She does shamanic practice, but she also told me she would never call herself a shaman. And she spent time, for example, with the Yavapai. They actually have a reservation in Camp Verde, which is further down the Verde Valley from Sedona. Others were less careful with the way that they would relate with indigenous people. They would call themselves shamans, they would sell turquoise jewelry for money, and some of them would even adopt ancestry. The most common being, of course, Cherokee, because Cherokees historically have been open to intermarriage. So a lot of people claim Cherokee ancestry, whether rightly or wrongly. And some of them would give themselves names. For example, one of my interlocutors called himself Stands with Bear. His first name was Randell. So a lot of it could be very problematic, especially in the way that indigenous people were related to and kind of repackaged for the use of white people without much reflection on the social reality of the native peoples in the area, or without much knowledge of it at all. And I don't really kind of want to pick on my interlocutors for being necessarily worse than anyone else in America, but that was unfortunately the way the situation was. So in terms of their nature religion, they nearly all agreed that Sedona was sacred because of the land, that kind of sacredness itself comes from the land, and that the real way to do spirituality was you just had to be out in nature. So a lot of them would move to Sedona just because they thought it was a beautiful place where they could be in nature, whether or not they kind of subscribe to this idea of vortexes. And this is something I found amongst the residents of the town, many of whom are retirees or second homeowners. They moved to Sedona because they felt it was beautiful. And some would say, for example, that you could see that it was God's creation that made it beautiful. So there was a kind of consensus in a way on the fact that Sedona was a beautiful place meant that it was somehow sacred, whether or not people were involved in spirituality. And this was also common amongst the tourists who came to visit. So, people who would come on short visits would often kind of describe having these really kind of mystical and ecstatic experiences on the vortexes. And one of them, vortexes in particular, was Bell Rock, where this is Peter Gersten. He's about 70 years old now. He's nearly 80 now. He climbs Bell Rock every day. So this particular rock and the fact that it's a vortex form the central part of his spiritual path. Every day he climbs this rock. He takes people up with him. Visitors, tourists mostly, sometimes it's people he knows, often he meets them through the Couchsurfers website. Now, he believes in particular that the act of climbing to the top of this rock will raise his vibration. And his aim in doing this is to open a portal that will lead him to the galactic center. And at the galactic center, he believes he can rewrite the source code that creates our simulated reality. He has this idea that reality is simulated, similar in line to Nick Bostrom's simulation theory. I think Elon Musk popularized it at some point. It's this idea that we all live in a simulation, basically, and you don't know if any of this is real or not. So in Peter's belief system, everything that we're experiencing is not real. It's all an illusion. He basically likened it to a video game. And by going to the galactic center and rewriting the source code that creates this reality, he could remove a virus that is poisoning this reality, which is the virus of technology, specifically silicone-based technology, things like smartphones. And he said that if aliens wanted to take over the world, they wouldn't need a death ray or an invasion. They would just poison our water supply and destroy all our resources. And that's in fact what was happening with ecological destruction. And it was his aim to solve this by going to the top of this rock every day, and then specifically going there on the 21st of December 2012, the winter solstice, which was also the end of the Mayan long count calendar. So I was there with him on the 21st of December 2012, as were maybe 50 to 100 people standing at the bottom of the rock watching. The Yavapai County sheriffs were there in a helicopter. The media were there. There was a local Fox affiliate. They were mostly in the parking lot though. But on the top of the rock, there was Peter, about 10 people he'd brought with him, and a few kind of random others who'd heard about this attempt he was going to make to go through a portal, because it had been popularized by Peter himself in a YouTube video as a leap of faith, which when he made the YouTube video, he did say he would jump off the rock to prove that the portal would open. Now, he had backed away from that claim by the time I got there, mostly because his daughter had told him to. She was worried about him. But there was kind of a lot of kind of buzz and hype that he was going to jump off the rock, that there was going to be this kind of spectacular kind of essentially suicide because he believed it was the end of the world, which wasn't quite what Peter was saying at the time, but that's why there were so many people there, and that's why the police were there, and that's why the media were there. But he came up, and this photo was taken on the 21st of December, I think. You can see on his arm, there's 2 tattoos. These are the barcodes he said that he would use to open the portal. They're symbols that mean faith. Peter took a lot of inspiration from TV and movies, especially the TV show Lost, but also things like one of the Indiana Jones movies, where the protagonist has to make a leap of faith in order for the thing they want to happen. So that was the idea behind jumping off the rock, that if he jumped, then the portal would have to open because he had made his leap of faith. In the end, he said he wasn't going to jump. He was just going to wait for 3 signs. And if he saw 3 signs that the portal was opening, then he'd do something. Fortunately, there were no signs. We were up there for 14 hours. People just started leaving throughout the day. And by the end of the day, he just came down after 14 hours. It was kind of disappointing. And then he got back and he posted a picture of Marvin, the depressed robot from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, on his Facebook, saying, "I didn't win." Because for him, winning would be getting the ending he wanted. He would get his portal and he would get to renew everything and move on. So I analyze this as a case of when prophecy fails, which is a book from 1956, where, again, it was on the 21st of December, but in 1956, a group around a figure called Marion Keech thought a UFO was going to come take them and save them from the destruction of the Earth. And the analysis made by Festinger et al. Is that there was cognitive dissonance, that's where the term comes from, after the event didn't happen, between their perception of reality and what had actually happened. So some people would think that it actually had happened just on a higher level, or it didn't happen because they weren't faithful enough, or the whole thing was bunk and they were going home. So there was a divergence amongst the followers of Keech. And with Peter, what I observed was that he spent about 2 weeks being depressed, and then he just reinvented a new date. Now, this is also quite common in the history of millenarianism and apocalypticism, that when one date fails, you just set a new date. That's what the Millerites did with the Great Disappointment in the 19th century. So Peter set a new date, which was the 21st of December 2018, also a winter solstice, and he continued bringing visitors up to the top of this rock. He had a whole ritual. He had a specific route he went up. People would take things to the top and do performances. Like he took someone with a cello up at one point, someone with a guitar, people would do yoga poses, and he posted them all on Facebook. So it was a really ritualized aspect to what he was doing. And then the 21st of December 2018 came around and the portal didn't open, and he was there, I think, for 40 hours. Then I was not there at that point, and I think he meditated and fasted for 40 hours on the top with a small group of people who had come in the past and were inspired enough by what he was doing to come back for this event. And so then after that one failed, he moved on to the explanation of, well, I think something did shift, but just on another dimension. And he's still living in Sedona. He's still taking people to the top of the rock. And I'm not sure if he set another date. He's taken about 4,000 people up so far, though. And he's just kind of turned taking the people up, that ritualized aspect of it, he's turned that into an end of itself. So instead of waiting for this kind of millenarian event anymore, it's more like the process of taking people to the top that he has focused on in the absence of, any kind of portal opening. And in the book, I kind of talk about this in terms of a frame of narrativization using the work of Jerome Bruner, because Peter's constantly telling and retelling his own story. And for him, that's how he creates his spiritual path, is through this creation of a story which he tells people verbally, but that he also, say, posts on Facebook about and like makes videos about. So it's about kind of creating an idealized life in the present, as well as projecting a perfected future that he is kind of messianically involved or kind of creating. So that's the second chapter, and that's kind of like a real focus on one specific person and his spiritual path and what he does to constitute that. I then try and broaden it out a bit more and talk about the economics of Sedona. So I mentioned briefly, Sedona is a small town with a lot of tourists and pretty much one industry, and that's tourism. So if you live in this town, you either have an independent income, like a passive income from retirement savings is a very common one, or from, like, say, military pensions, or from a job that you can work remotely, or you work in tourism. And if you work in tourism, it's unlikely you can actually afford the rent in Sedona. Most of the people that work in the town actually live in places like Cottonwood and Clarkdale, because it's cheap at Flagstaff, because they just can't afford the rent in Sedona. Sedona, the average house price, I think, is $500,000 roughly. It's also, and this is not coincidental, something like 91.4% white. So it's a wealthy, affluent white town. And it's hard to live there. So how, if you're moving there to follow your spiritual path, do you maintain yourself? So for one of the things you have is you have these stores like this picture here. I don't think the store exists anymore. It used to be by the Y, which is what's now Tlaquepaque North. But yeah, they had great psychics, crystals, drums. So you could work in a new age store, as they're roughly called. But what most people did is create some kind of small business or kind of independent kind of entrepreneurial endeavor that was somehow related to spirituality. So for example, I met someone who did holistic pedicures, and she had actually managed to establish herself quite successfully in the town. In the third chapter, I describe people called starseeds. Now, a starseed is someone who thinks that they are an alien in a human body, and they're most often from a star system like the Pleiades or Arcturus. Some of them say they're from Lyra. And people with starseeds actually are able to maintain themselves through online, almost like an online religious practice. And I found this really fascinating because, so what they would do is they do YouTube videos where they talk about how do you know you're a starseed? What are the symptoms of ascension? Or they would do readings via, well, it was Skype back then, but I guess they use Zoom now. So it was kind of a way of maintaining themselves in something they felt was consonant with their spiritual path. Because if you just go work in the tourist industry, which some people did, but most people involved in spirituality didn't want to do that because they felt that that would lower their vibration. So they were trying to live in a place where it was already difficult to live economically, doing something that was consonant with their spiritual path, which was even harder. So a lot of people left. And this is kind of where the idea of energy would come back in. So the idea that Sedona would chew you up and spit you out, that was often applied to people who had come to the town, tried to live their spiritual path there, found they couldn't afford it because they couldn't work, they couldn't afford rent, and then they had to move on. So there was this self-justificatory aspect of the idea of energy, whereby people who were economically successful was also seen as spiritually developed. So if you were able to maintain an existence in one of these kind of spiritual businesses in Sedona, other people would take that as a sign of your highest spiritual elevation. And I talk about two people in the fourth chapter who call themselves conscious entrepreneurs. and they ran a business selling kombucha that they made themselves. They also sold essences, flower, German herbal essences. People in spirituality love essential oils. They think they cure a range of diseases, but they also just kind of make you feel nice and add to the ambience of their room. So the pair the conscious entrepreneurs, they had a whole series of businesses selling things that they would make, products that people involved in spirituality wanted. And they also had some fairly strict diet rules. They were raw food vegans. So in the book, I talk about this in terms of like kind of aiming towards purity. So one of the ways you raise your vibration is by purifying yourself physically. So that means like no meat, obviously no smoking or no drinking, right? Living as pure and as kind of aesthetically as you possibly can, and this will raise your vibration. So they maintain themselves quite successfully, but they, also leveraged a number of kind of social privileges that they had. They were both white, they were both from well-off middle-class families. I think one of them was related to a former governor of Colorado. So they were from backgrounds where it was quite possible for them to get the capital to start a business, maintain themselves in this place which had high rent, and where running a business was expensive, especially if you wanted some kind of physical store to run, which they had for a while. But I think they consciously uncoupled just after I left in 2015, I think. And now one of them, the man, I call him Findle in the book, he kind of travels between Sedona and like Lake Atitlan, I think it is, in Guatemala, and other kind of sacred sites, selling his essences. So they've moved on from Sedona, but they kind of did it in a way that maintained their kind of level of perceived spiritual elevation because they're still being materially successful. And so this is where the skip, right, becomes relevant, right? The skip from the individual to the cosmological. So in a way, everything in spirituality is kind of rooted to the individual. The individual creates their own reality through the vibration of their energy. So if you're poor, that's essentially your own fault because you haven't raised your vibration sufficiently, while ignoring the fact that the people who are seen as having a high vibration and being elevated spiritually often have a very high amount of social and economic privilege. So they're ignoring their own structural factors that benefit them while claiming to have this kind of spiritual gifts. And it's a form of what I call prosperity consciousness, which is like the spirituality version of prosperity gospel, which you may have heard of. People like Paula White, Donald Trump was in a prosperity gospel church. And it comes from, in fact, the person who ran that church was Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. And it comes from New Thought. So New Thought is the tradition that Peale was in. And it's this idea that, you make affirmations to maintain yourself positively. And that's how you are successful and happy and healthy. And this is very common in spirituality as well. You eat the right foods. You don't say anything bad about anyone. You kind of be positive in all the aspects that you possibly can. And that's raising your vibration. Everything is kind of individually controlled in that way, in the way they see it, at least. So for example, Findle and his girlfriend Buttercup, they would like change their language. So they wouldn't say as you like, they would say as you love, because that had a higher vibration. So not everyone went to the same extent as those two, I would say. But the kind of the principles behind what they were doing were the common principles in spirituality. So there was this way that spirituality kind of reified and reinforced people who were economically successful in Sedona, while at the same time denying the structural conditions of that success. The weird thing about all this positivity is that at the same time, people were constantly talking about things that you might call conspiracy theories. I didn't think when I got to the field, I would be talking about conspiracy theories at all. I was not prepared for it. And it kind of like was one of those kind of gradual realizations. People would start saying things like, they're doing a lot of spraying today. And I'd be like, spraying what? And they're like, spraying chemtrails. Do you know about the chemtrails? And I was like, I have never heard of chemtrails before. They also believed the water was fluoride in the water was being added, and that vaccinations were toxic. So all of this is kind of like an attack of the environment, or on the environment, on their bodies, that would limit their spiritual ascension. So fluoride calcifies the pineal gland, they told me, which would literally sever your connection to source. Chemtrails is, they think that planes spray heavy metals, which they call aluminum, even though aluminum isn't actually a heavy metal, but that's what they said. They said that planes sprayed heavy metals like aluminum and boron, and the effect of these gases being sprayed into the atmosphere was to control our minds, you know, make us infertile, to create mass depopulation. Now, why on earth would anyone want to do this? Well, it turned out there's a satanic conspiracy to rule the world. This chart was given to me by the very first person I ever stayed with in Sedona. And yeah, I mean, I don't know how clear it is on your screens, but you can see there's everyone there, from like the Rothschilds to the Luciferians, the Templars, the Russian Revolution makes the Rothschilds again, the United Nations, the House of Rockefeller, like anyone who's ever been accused at any point in history of being involved in the secret society, I think, is on this chart. So they call this the Dark Cabal. And I was told that the Dark Cabal wants to keep us in the third dimension, because in the third dimension, there's money, and the Dark Cabal makes a lot of money in the third dimension from basically keeping us all, and this is their term, not mine, enslaved. We're all enslaved by the Dark Cabal, which is sort of also sometimes referred to as reptilians, which is this idea from David Icke, a British author who's very popular amongst people involved in spirituality. He suggested that there was this race of lizard-like aliens, that all of the elites are really these reptilians. So those are my interlocutors who thought themselves of as starseeds, would see themselves in a kind of Manichaean battle against these reptilians, trying to elevate the vibration of the planet to defeat their evil schemes to keep us in the third dimension of pain, suffering, and, well, slavery. And I thought this was very strange. I was like, if you think that the way to develop spiritually is to be positive all the time, why are you constantly talking about these very negative theories about what's going on in the world? And what I realized is, so it's a form of theodicy. It's an explanation of why evil exists, right? So if the new age is inevitable, it's going to happen, we're all working on our spiritual path, why hasn't it happened yet? There's someone keeping us down. It creates an easy enemy to blame for the fact that the ascension hasn't happened yet. But more than that, it's a way of diagnosing the problems they see in the world that spirituality is the answer for. And it kind of creates this kind of grandiose battle for them to be fighting. Like, I think there's something very almost like optimistic and like kind of like validating to think that you're on the side of good fighting the forces of evil, and that there's something you can do about all these structural problems. Like, instead of seeing poverty and war and everything else as kind of these complex social processes that are really hard to disentangle, instead you just see them the work of a few very evil individuals. And then all you need to do is get rid of those individuals, right? And then everything's fine. It's like an easy answer. So in the book, I really focus on chemtrails, on the chapter on conspiracy. And I called that chapter, What is Wrong with America? The Counter Narrative of Conspiracy, because the way I kind of interpret these conspiracies is a counter narrative. So anything that happens can be assimilated into the counter narrative. If there's an attack, it's a false flag. If someone dies, they're not really dead, right? There's always a way to kind of explain the official version of events within the counter narrative. And so they're constantly assimilating everything that happens into this alternative explanation. Now, where this gets interesting is when I wrote that chapter, I was like, maybe writing What is Wrong with America is a bit harsh. And then in 2020, COVID happened. And my interlocutors in Sedona all pretty much, with a few notable exceptions, they all denied COVID was real. They said it was a hoax. They said it was spread by 5G, which gave it to bats, and that it was just another action by the dark cabal to control us. And they became anti-maskers, and they started to, they were always very politically, kind of, yeah, as I said, almost like politically alienated, but they started to align with what you might call a more right-wing politics. Most of it is more like some version of libertarianism, but some of it is more in line with what, and this may be quite surprising, with Christian nationalism and even QAnon. So these are all Facebook posts from the last year. So I've been kind of following the people I know in Sedona, for the last year online, because I don't want to hang out with them in person. And you can see these are their concerns. 5G is a big one. This is a QAnon post. These are all the people they think have been murdered for denouncing child sex trafficking. I'll go into more detail about QAnon in a minute. And this is a post, this one here with the figures is basically about COVID. It's posting death rates in a number of different countries, saying that if you look at 2020, all these countries have a lower death rate, therefore this pandemic that the dark cabal is essentially inventing isn't really happening because fewer people are dying in 2020 than before. So the 5G, I think, is interesting because it's kind of a continuation of these kind of environmental conspiracies, like, with the chemtrails and fluoridation. When I was in Sedona, their problem was smart meters. So smart meters send your electricity reading automatically from your house to APS, Arizona Public Service, who then bill you. And it's just a device for saving money, right? But because it uses an electromagnetic frequently and it's sending signals through the air, they see it as a form of pollution. They're very concerned about electromagnetic frequency pollution. Wi-Fi even is kind of seen as polluting, but most of them have smartphones and use the internet, so they kind of tolerate that. But 5G is seen as like even worse. So you really, so Wi-Fi, they were like kind of, it's a necessary evil, but 5G, they really think is going to like give you coronavirus and pollute you and keep you in the third dimension. So, for example, I now have a friend who refuses to come into my apartment because he realized that I have 5G. So that's kind of a continuation. Like I kind of expected 5G to be, a problem for them because it's part of this like constant environmental toxicity that they see spirituality as a way of kind of fighting against. But the QAnon really kind of, I was a little bit stunned at first that they would kind of get into that. And then there's this guy. This is Jake Angeli. He's from Phoenix. He's a well-known figure from the Capitol siege on January 6th. He was there in the Senate chamber, as the picture here shows, doing what he calls shamanic calls. So when the pictures of Angeli came out, a lot of people focused on his tattoos. He has a Mjolnir, he has a Valknut. These are tattoos with Norse heritage that are associated with some Asatru and Odinist groups, some of which are white supremacists, but not all Odinist groups are white supremacists. And as far as I can tell, Jake Angeli is not in any kind of Odinist or Asatru group. He also has, bricks and, Greek signs on his shoulders. So I think his tattoos are kind of a bricolage, because when I looked into he does podcast interviews. There's spirituality podcast, of course, and he wrote a book. Here it is, One Mind at a Time, A Deep State of Illusion. You can get it for Amazon for $10. In this, he basically goes through every single conspiracy you could think of, and then at the end, his solution for conspiracy theories is in fact to follow a spiritual path. And he talks about, yes, eating organic food, which he became famous for requesting in prison. And he talks about following a shamanic path of taking psychedelic drugs as a way of awakening. He had his awakening through, I believe it was consuming magic mushrooms. And after that, he started calling himself a shaman. But as a person who, before his awakening, he described himself as a George Bush voting Republican, his spirituality also took something of a kind of right-wing political bent, and he got involved in the QAnon movement. So QAnon is this apocalyptic online movement where there are these cryptic drops on an image board called 4chan, later 8chan, and then 8kun, which predicts the arrest of well-known Democratic figures such as Hillary Clinton, because they are part of the dark cabal. And Donald Trump is fighting a war against this cabal, who are involved in satanic ritual, they're involved in child trafficking, pretty much anything bad they're involved in. The deep state is what it's more often called in QAnon lore. But you can see how this kind of fitted very well with spirituality, which already had this idea of the dark cabal who were doing all these nefarious things to control and enslave us. And so QAnon, which kind of came from this like racist, anti-Semitic image board, and then really got popularized online amongst Christian nationalists, white evangelicals especially, also appealed to people involved in New Age spirituality, because they also had this idea of a sinister force controlling the world, specifically inhibiting their religious practice and undermining them spiritually, like a personal spiritual attack. And among my interlocutors, a lot of them are now advocates and promoters of QAnon. Which is very, very strange. But as I said, it kind of makes sense given the way they were already involved with conspiracism. Okay. I think that's all. Yeah, I got to the end. I'm actually not sure what the time is or whether I've spoken long enough. Questions?
Excellent. Yes. I don't know if I'm seen again. Yes. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. I know you were saying you're speaking to an audience of Arizonans, but we haven't studied Sedona in this context, so I think we find it really compelling. Sure. So I'll just to the audience. I know when it's a webinar, you don't know how many people are in the room with you, so I'll tell you what I see. I see a list of about 44 attendees, a good mix of religious studies folks and stuff from folks from other institutions and other parts of ASU. So I would encourage you to go ahead and put your question into the Q&A function. I've seen a couple come in, and we have about 36 minutes for questions. So feel free to, if you have something you're thinking of, to put it in, and I will try to choose questions that have the broadest appeal to start with, and then we'll hone in on some details if we should like.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's fine. I've just been yabbering at people. So excellent. So I've seen a few come in, and oh, hello. Yeah. Very cool. Few questions come in, and I'm actually going to choose this third one that just popped up because I think, let's see, I think there's a good connection to this comparative angle, because so much of what you describe has some overlap with various forms of Christianity. You mentioned the Millerites, you mentioned various forms of the prosperity gospel. So Mackenzie asks, what do these spiritual followers believe will happen to them in the afterlife? Does raising their vibrations on Earth have an important impact on them once they pass? And I think that's very good, because it gets into these questions of this worldly change versus otherworldly salvation, and sort of how that all fits in there. So
yeah, so they don't actually believe in the afterlife. Yeah. As I think I didn't really go into any detail, but they believe in reincarnation. So when you get to the end of this life, you cross what they call the rainbow bridge. And then your soul is reincarnated into another body. And when you're in that incarnational state, you make a choice. You choose. You say, do I want to go on Earth? Do I want to go to the Pleiades? And you kind of decide which dimension you're incarnated into, and you make a contract with your incarnated self. And then when you're incarnated, you forget all of this. You don't know what your mission is. You don't know why you chose to be here. So your spiritual path is kind of divining why it is that you, before you were incarnated, chose to be in this life that you're in and what your mission is. So the example of Peter, like he felt his mission was going up to this rock and taking people to the top of it. And that was it. That was his mission in this life. That's what he'd chosen to do. So in a way, it really kind of reinforces this idea of individualism and kind of ignoring structural conditions, because anything that happens in your life is what you already chose. So if you've kind of got a sucky existence in this reality, you chose that. So there's some lesson you're meant to be learning.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we have a question from actually a member of our forum committee, Terry Shoemaker, who asks, as you state, many of your interlocutors are white and quite privileged. Do you have any sense of why they embrace the notion that sinister sources are working against them? Are there fears that they're losing something?
Maybe. There's this pervasive sense that America is in decline. And I noticed that amongst the people that I spoke to, either those involved in spirituality and those that not. There seems to be amongst Americans this idea that their country is in kind of terrible decline. And I found that kind of weird. I was like, what do you mean? You're like the superpower in the whole world. You know, because when you're not American, you know, you kind of understand how like huge America is everywhere else. So when you come here and people are like, things are not great here, they're in decline, they're not as good as they used to be, you're like, what? So there's definitely this sense of kind of social decay, I think would be the best way to put it. And that there were forces responsible for this, right? And that those forces could be personified and fought. And they were very unaware of their own privilege as well. You know, there's this kind of pervasive sense that, you know, I worked for everything I have, right? I heard this all the time, you know, I made good decisions. Those people who don't have what they need, they obviously didn't make good decisions. They didn't make good choices. Often it wasn't as blunt as that, but that was kind of the kind of animating feeling behind their sentiments, I found. And, you know, I found a lot of kind of relatable material in Ali Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, this idea of, you know, people in Louisiana, white people who kind of carry around this suitcase of grievance, feeling like they made all the right choices, they did everything right, and they see all these other people of color getting things before them who don't deserve it, right? So there's this real like deservingness discourse, which really kind of conceals the racism in what they're saying. So they don't think of themselves as racist, and they don't think of themselves as privileged even. They think of themselves as just honest, hardworking people.
Great, yeah, fascinating conversation. We have a few more coming in, and I'm going to try to answer some that take a somewhat different angle, because there's some that overlap a bit. Charles is asking, as a sort of meta-level scholarly question, I'm wondering how you think about this injunction, especially within religious studies, to take seriously our subjects. Many academics, I guess, find your subjects to be a bit silly or unserious. So in what ways do you take them seriously? And what does that actually mean? And why, and in what ways should we, other scholars, take this seriously?
Yeah, that's a really good
different level, yeah.
Because I mean, I feel like I get asked some variation of this question a lot. You know, it's like, how do you take them seriously? Are they mad? You know,
right?
What you're describing that makes it sound a bit funny. Do you think that's appropriate? And I would say it's actually something I have actually struggled with. So I'm an anthropologist by training, and so we have this idea of like empirical or like methodological kind of agnosticism, right? You don't take on what your interlocutors say and believe, but you also don't judge it. So I wasn't there to kind of judge what anyone was doing or kind of make any normative decisions about what they were doing. However, I'm still a human. So when I was there, you know, I would still constantly make normative evaluations of things that they were doing or saying, because often they would do things that I would find just frankly crazy. You know, for example, they drink bleach as a cure. It's called MMS. It got popularized, I think, by Donald Trump. Like, that's been around in spirituality circles for like 10 years now, drinking a form of chlorine. And I was like, I think you might be poisoning yourself, and that's not good, right? So like, where do you draw the line, right? Do I have a responsibility when someone's telling me they're gonna drink bleach to be like, no, please don't do that? And I don't have any very easy or like quick answers on this question. As much as I tried not to take on what my interlocutors believed and did, I sometimes had these moments where it seemed to make sense. I remember having this, because when they started talking about dimensions, and they were like, we're ascending to the fifth dimension. I was like, I don't think that's how dimensions work. The fourth dimension is time. I don't think you can get to the fifth dimension. And then I spoke to a physicist, and he was like, well, you know, there's about 10 maybe dimensions of space-time that we theorize at the moment. And I was like, wow, I actually don't understand about dimensions at all. Like, how do I know the things that I think are true? And how do I know that the things that my interlocutors are saying are true or false? So you really, like, especially as an anthropologist in the field, you have these like moments of like existential crisis where you're just like, what do I know is true? And so I guess the workaround I always take is basically, you should always approach people with humility. And I think this is a great antidote to conspiracy, by the way, because conspiracy theory thinking is, I think it's a bit contagious. Like if you spend all your day with people who are constantly connecting dots and telling you that things are harmful, you start to believe it too. Like I got told that my form of birth control was harmful. It was giving me cancer. And I'd actually had like a cancer scare right before I went in the field. And I really believed it for a while, and I stopped taking my birth control. So, you know, I wouldn't call myself an irrational person, but, you know, when you have had, especially health crises, and people are saying, oh, this is what's causing that health crisis, you're like, what if they're right? You know, and you start doing things or changing your behavior, and then that can lead to another thing. You know, maybe if you get a positive result from that first thing you changed, maybe you try to do another thing and another thing, and then suddenly you're down a rabbit hole, and then suddenly you believe in QAnon. So always approach any idea with humility. There's a lot of things in this world I don't understand. Other people's lives are not my lives, and mostly I'm here to record and analyze. Not to judge. That's just not what an anthropologist does. I'm also not a journalist, so I'm not trying to expose anyone. So I kind of take a different approach that way as well. Like I see that there are important kind of activist stances that you should take in your work. So for example, in my chapter where I talk about their relations with Indigenous people, I do become quite critical of the way they talk about the Native Americans, and especially the way they adopt Native American identities sometimes. You know, this is called pretendianism, and it's part of cultural genocide. You know, and people in Indigenous studies like Kim Tolbert have written about this very effectively. So I think there's some stances that you should take in relation to your interlocutors, especially if your interlocutors are problematic, and especially if they're more kind of relative to you in a position of power. Then you should at least be trying to contextualize what they're doing in terms of those power relations.
Thank you so much. We have so many wonderful questions coming in. I'm going to try to combine two of them or ask them because they deal with a similar thing. So from audience member Sushrut, we have a question. What would you say could be the reasons for the New Age movement jumping from personal to universal, skipping the societal, etc. stages? Is it to minimize conflict between their ideas and the present societal religious structures they live in? Or could there be some other questions? And I'm going to take the liberty of also sort of holding up side by side a similar question, because it's asking about that in-between layer. You mentioned, or this is from Amanda, you mentioned earlier that they focus on awareness of self and of the universe, but have a gap where there's no question of how their self relates to the people and the world around them. Do you see any instances where they were confronted with questions or circumstances about how their path relates to other people or in their environment? If so, how do they respond? Is there any effect you see that prevents or excuses them from thinking about and taking responsibility for the interaction between their path and the people around them? So
yes,
a little different, but overlapping there. Yeah.
So this is Alexander, everyone.
Yes. And we had some pandemic parenting solidarity in the Q&A chat as well. So thanks for that.
I had childcare and they... You need to come on, stand up. So, oh, Daddy's here. Okay, well then go talk to Dad. I'm very sorry. Anyway,
it's all relevant.
Okay, so the reason why I think they skip the middle level. Okay, so I think part of it is because of a very strong American tradition of individualism. Now, this is very strong in a place like Arizona, especially. You've got this whole kind of like frontier mythology, the rugged individual, but also just this idea that you know, the successful American person is self-made. You've got kind of paragons like Benjamin Franklin, who was, okay, now my pets are here. Hi, Cassie, do you want to come talk to everyone too?
We want to meet them, of course.
Yes, you've got this strong tradition of individualism. So I think that is kind of like the cultural kind of moss or fuel that kind of this springs up from or grows up from. But I think also that skipping the middle level is easier, because then you don't have to reckon with your own complicity in the structures that you are benefiting from. And the other question asked for an example, and I can give a great example of this with Peter. So Peter, the guy who wanted to go through a portal, his job, when he had a job before he was retired, was as a public defender. Before that, he was a defense attorney in New York City. That was too stressful. He spent a while suing the government for UFO files. Yes. But then the UFO people thought he was too crazy. And then he decided to move to Sedona and just work as a public defender to pay the bills. Now, he told me that most of his clients were Navajo and Hopi, and they were nearly all guilty. And they were guilty for things like DUI, driving under influence, aggravated DUI, which is where you've had more than one of these charges, and domestic violence. And I actually asked him one day, I was like, well, you know, your clients don't seem to have created their perfect simulation, because for him, life is a simulation. You create it as you want. He lives in a perfect reality, right? His perfected reality. Everything is as he chose it. And it's the same for everyone else too. So I was like, what about your clients? Do you think they chose what they're going through? You know, do you think that they chose to live on a reservation? Do you think they chose to be, you know, profiled by the police? Do you think that the Navajo chose to have something like 50% of inmates in Coconino County Jail are Navajo and Hopi, and like the level of population is much, much lower. So per capita, they have a much higher rate of incarceration. And he was just like, well, I guess they just chose a crappy simulation. And it was a way to really deny his complicity in the criminal justice system, which we all know in America is horribly racist and, you know, punitive. And I could go on, but I'm not going to, because I'll get distracted by talking about how terrible the criminal justice system is in this country. But, you know, he was part of that. And he didn't really care about his job. His whole attitude was like, oh, my clients are guilty, and I just talk them into taking plea deals. Like 95% of people who get charged with a crime in America take a plea deal because it's cheaper. Because you can't get out of jail if you can't pay your bail unless you take a plea deal. So you plead guilty because you can't afford to be innocent. And instead of like reckoning with his complicity in this, he just went, this is what they chose. So I think skipping middle levels in that way was convenient, but also kind of soothing, right? You know, everyone's getting what they deserve. I have all these wonderful things. I live in this beautiful house in this beautiful town. I get to go hiking every day because I made the right choices and I deserve, isn't it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's great. Let's see if I can keep up with it, with some of these questions, and some of them, you know, they have touch upon things that you've discussed again, but there might be more layers to it. So I'm circling back to this theme of conspiracy. I see two questions. One is from my colleague Agnes. How do you explain the apparent elective affinity between New Age spirituality and conspiracy theories? I know you spoke about theodicy, but you know, is there something more? And I'm going to do another attempt at a combined question. So our Michaela, an audience member, asks, do other countries with a less distinct separation of church and state have less acceptance of spirituality and conspiracy theories? Does the United States' reliance on Lockean liberalism provide an open channel to the rabbit hole of spirituality to conspiracy? So I threw a lot at you. If either one of those resonates, or, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, so the first one was, how do you explain the elective affinity between New Age spirituality and conspiracy theories? And I guess the one is asking is, well, maybe is there anything unique about the United States here?
Yeah. So What you might call conspiracy theory has a lot of kind of structural, kind of epistemological structural similarities with conspiracy theory thinking. Everything is connected, right? There are no coincidences. The people in power are lying to you. You know, if you've already decided you really like astrology and everyone who's in kind of scientific authority is telling you that's total bunk, and you know it doesn't exist, when you're like, but no, I really believe in astrology, then you might start to believe that other things that the scientific authorities have you know, debunked would also be true. So this is kind of the drift of stigmatized knowledge. So once you start believing in one form of stigmatized knowledge, people tend to start believing in other forms of stigmatized knowledge. So yeah, so you've got the structural similarities, you've got stigmatized knowledge, and then you've also got, like, I like to call it swimming in the same sea. You're on the internet, you're watching your nice spirituality videos, and then suddenly YouTube takes you to one that's about like ancient Egypt and maybe how aliens created the pyramids, and then the next one might be how, you know, the government's denying existence of aliens in ancient Egypt, and you know, so, and a lot okay, algorithms encourage this kind of rabbit hole as well. Absolutely. I don't necessarily think the internet caused this in any instrumental way, but they definitely enable and facilitate and monetize it with their algorithms, which kind of give you all these like autoplays and these suggestions. And like my YouTube is a total car crash because of all the spirituality videos I watch. And they send you up conspiracy videos as well, because people who are into one are into the other. The algorithms know this, and then they get shown it. And a lot of the spokespeople kind of work in the same milieus as well. Like David Wilcock is a big promoter of QAnon now. Now he's been a speaker in spirituality for decades, I think. Like when I was in the field, people were like, David Wilcock, he's great, because he was talking about the Ascension. And then he started talking about QAnon. So a lot of people who were already listening to David Wilcock went and started paying attention to QAnon. So yeah, there's a number of reasons why there's this elective affinity. And the other one about church and state and the United States, and I'm just going to say no. I'm just going to say no. I can explain that a bit further. Conspiracy theories are actually a facet of societies around the world. Like American conspiracies have a very kind of American flavor. And if you want to read the Declaration of Independence, there's all kinds of what you might call conspiracy theories about what George III and the British were doing. Not that I'm being pro-British. But do you see what I mean? So they're kind of a perennial part of political but also kind of health and medical history. And conspiracy theories didn't used to really be seen as a problem, right? It was only like Karl Popper and Richard Hofstadter in the mid-20th century when they kind of codified this idea that people in democracies should be rational in order to make good voting decisions, when conspiracy theories became problematic. Previously, it was kind of accepted that people, you know, especially people with less education, would believe crazy things. This was the elite view. But, you know, elites in themselves constantly mobilize conspiracy theories in order to gain power. I mean, what was Donald Trump doing during the Capitol siege? He was spreading conspiracy theories about election rigging. That was never true, and there's no evidence of it, right? But he used it to try and stay in power. So this is like a really old dynamic that you see in societies throughout history and cross-culturally, right? You get people to believe things, you direct them towards a specific enemy, and then you take advantage of all the emotion you whipped up, direct them towards that enemy, and take power yourself. So no, I don't think it's got anything to do with church and state. I think it's got to do with power. Conspiracies are part of how people take power.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you. I see another connection between two. You can let me know after this if that my method works. But my colleague Shala is asking, talking about illusion, when their predictions about the end fail, do they ever see their own vision as an illusion? Similar to someone who's asking, said they came to the webinar a bit late, but they're asking, why do you think people still believe conspiracy theories after they've been debunked or proved false, after those great disappointments?
Thinking doesn't work. No one cares about your facts. Like, I've spoken to so many people who believe so many things that I think are just plainly false. But okay, the reason why conspiracy theories have persuasive power is because they are unfalsifiable, right? But a lot of other things are unfalsifiable. Love, systemic racism, like family connections. Like none of these things can actually be empirically validated in any way. We believe all kinds of things that have no falsifiable in the Popperian sense, which is where the term conspiracy theory comes from. You know, they have no falsifiability. So, and I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with believing in astrology if you find it useful to you. I don't think you necessarily have to believe in things that are falsifiably true. Do you see what I mean? So, and a lot of people derive great benefit from them, right? I'm going to use astrology as an example as well because it is quite benign. Oh my gosh, sorry. I don't know why, but my eyes started watering there. So I'm not crying. Oh man, it's the dust on my glasses or something. But you see what I mean? So you can find astrology comforting. A lot of people do. And it's kind of like an interesting kind of psychological game to play with yourself. Like it's a way of describing yourself to yourself, which is actually a really important social thing to be able to do. What are you told when you're trying to get a job? You're told to create a personal brand, right? What is a personal brand but a way of describing yourself to yourself and then trying to project that to others? That's exactly what astrology does. It's exactly what categories like boomers and millennials do, right? And we use this in discourse all the time. And it's mostly unproblematic that these things have absolutely no basis in fact. And if you try and argue against someone who believes in conspiracy theories by saying, well, this has been debunked, they just don't believe you, right? They already knew your argument and they've already gone the other way. You know, because I found when I was talking to people about chemtrails, I was like, well, the EPA says it's not true. And they're like, ha, the EPA, you believe those reptilians kind of thing. You know, so then I'm part of, you know, the other side that they're not going to believe. And anything I say is already undermined. You know, if you genuinely believe that society is run by a cabal of pedophilic child traffickers, you're not going to believe anything those people say. And anyone kind of also saying those things is just one of the sheeple who's still asleep, right? So this is why the antidote to conspiracy is not more information. It's not debunking. It's humility and compassion. People do come around, actually. Not in this kind of, I know it's really tempting to think like, I'm just going to show them that there's no basement in that pizzeria and I will debunk Pizzagate for them. That's not how it works. But people do eventually come around. And it's usually when whatever system of thinking they've got involved in loses salience for them. They, you know, it's lost them too many friends. It's alienated them from their family. Maybe they lost their job. You're starting to see this amongst QAnon followers now with the Capitol siege. Now, some have gone even further into the bunker and are saying the whole thing was a false flag attack by Antifa to discredit us. You know, there's always a counter explanation. That's why the counter narrative is so effective. You can always make an argument against, well, anything that's happened by just saying, well, I just think that that was a hoax, you know? But some people are starting to see their way out and they are starting to say, wait, nothing that Q said would happen has happened. You know, he said Hillary Clinton was going to get arrested in November 2017. And guess what? Hillary Clinton is still not in jail. So either you have to believe that there's a real Hillary Clinton in jail somewhere and there's a double walking around, or you just have to accept you were wrong. And it's just like, a lot of it is like the sunk cost fallacy. Like how many costs what have you sunk into believing this? Like, what have you given up? And what is it getting you? If you're one of the people that's benefiting directly monetarily from spreading these theories, you're not going to give up anytime quickly. Like the Q promoters are not going to stop anytime quickly because they make money off those YouTube channels and they make money off that merchandise, right? This is their whole job. So they're going to keep trying to spin this and they're going to keep trying to keep it going. And people are going to believe it as long as that belief benefits rather than, on balance, detriments them, right? When that balance is too far in that this is really hurting me, then they might start to back away from it. But that's only really relevant to the really kind of harmful conspiracy theories like QAnon. You can believe in chemtrails your whole life, you know? All you do is, I don't know, maybe take some supplements which you think are protecting yourself from the chemtrails. And that's not causing you any hardships at all, really, except the price of supplements, which are also most commonly sold by people who are trying to maintain some kind of spiritual business or some kind of online influencer. Alex Jones, who does InfoWars, has a whole line of supplements. So does Gwyneth Paltrow. It's interesting where these things overlap.
Right, right. Wow, there is still so much more that I'd like to get to, but I'm going to steer toward ones that are kind of broader religious studies questions. So we have one from Jenny, audience member Jenny. How do you feel these folks you study challenge how scholars think about religion? So we're going to span way out. Specifically, does it challenge our assumptions about the category of religion itself?
You know, I think it does, on a couple of levels. So the first is the level of what kind of the use of the category religion in everyday dialogue and discourse, because my interlocutors would say what they were doing is not religion. In fact, spirituality is separate from religion and superior to religion. You know, they like to make these memes where like religion is someone else telling you what to do, spirituality is following your own path. It's like a Deepak Chopra quote or something. So they make this contrast constantly. And by religion, they really mean organized, institutionalized religion as they've experienced in America. And they're most often thinking about some form of Christianity, right? Which is most often the background that they've come from. And they've often left that because they found it too dogmatic. Perhaps they were appalled by abuses. You know, they have a critique of religion already. And that's why they turn to spirituality, because they see it as something flexible, dynamic, individual, something they chose and that they do that is beneficial to the world, right? Because they support this ascension that's going to end ecological destruction and capitalism, everything else that's bad, right? And sorry, it's my son again. Okay. Oh.
No apologies needed.
Yeah, so that's the individual level, which they kind of challenge the category religion, and they distinguish spirituality from it, and they in fact negate the value of religion, I would say, while at the same time still using a whole host of religious symbols, right? Angels, for example, Catholic saints, you know, these are very popular in spirituality. Now, how it also challenges the category religion is on an analytic level. Like, what is religion if these people doing it have no real authority structure, no institution like a church or a congregation? They don't even have to be connected to their local community. They can be connected to a community online that they only ever see via kind of YouTube or their Zoom meetings, you know? And this really undermines how they don't get along with each other very often in Sedona, because they don't need to. So, you know, there's like this social cohesion aspect to kind of the function of religion, if you want to call it that way, which is actually undermined by spirituality. It increases this level of atomization because they don't need to get along with other people who are involved in spirituality. In fact, they more often see them as competitors for followers, people who will pay them, you know, people who will listen to them and think they're worthy, right? You know, so they're always discrediting each other. So-and-so doesn't do real religion. So-and-so is vampires, right? They're spiritual vampires. They'll just suck your energy, right? I was constantly being warned against other people in Sedona by people in Sedona. Right? So, you know, so, okay, so there's no authority structure. There's no institutional like body like a church or a congregation. You know, there's no single doctrine, right? You can essentially believe what you want. Now, it's interesting that there are conventionalized forms that their beliefs take, and that I was able to kind of extract this cosmology. No one explained that cosmology to me in the way I describe it in the book. I sat there and tried to figure it out because everyone would tell me spirituality is so different. Everyone really just does their own thing. You know, they say that to me constantly. Like they're all like super creative individuals. You know, it's like we're all individuals just like everyone else. So, and I take a very anthropological view of like religion. I don't really worry too much about the category religion in the way that maybe if you're in religious studies, you're maybe more obliged to do when you write your thesis. I kind of took this view of like, well, religion is what people do when it looks like they're being religious, right? Because when you look at religion anthropologically, like, you know, how is ritual in the Papua New Guinean highlands related to, say, the Catholic Church? Is it even appropriate to call both of these things religion? Does the category have any validity outside its cultural context? You know, and that's an open question in the anthropology of religion. How much can you cross-culturally apply the term religion? Is this a culture-bound term that we should not apply cross-culturally? And it's interesting, in terms of spirituality, is it even appropriate for me to call it religion when they say quite clearly, this is not religion? You know, do I as an analyst say, no, 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 I think what you're doing is religion, you know, even though you've just told me quite explicitly, it's not religion. So how do we account for that as theorists? I mean, and then again, I say that, but to me, it seems quite clear that what they're doing is religion. You know, you can go back to like some of the earliest definitions of religion, like there are supernatural entities, you know, there are meta-empirical beliefs, you know, there are ways of combining in communities that create communitas. They're really into their drum circles, you know, and these are all things that happen with religion. And maybe the word religion can be more of a weight to our analysis than a benefit. You know, it kind of drags us down into the weeds rather than lifting us up into something insightful. So I tend to just talk about spirituality as, yeah, it's religious, you know.
Right, because we do see that in some evangelical circles, right? This is not religion, this is the true faith, right?
Right? Yeah, exactly.
So I think you may have actually touched on this question, but just to make sure we caught it. So my colleague Evan Berries is curious about QAnon as an interfaith phenomenon. You've given such a compelling account of how New Age spiritualities and white evangelicalism are predisposed for related but distinct reasons to take on conspiracy thinking. But in terms of QAnon as a social movement, as an active and ongoing discursive space, how do these constituencies relate and interact? And you're saying, right, was that what you were mentioning earlier, is kind of seeing each other as the as the competitor?
Well, so the competitor was more people within spirituality seeing other people who are also engaged in spirituality as competitors. So actually, it's kind of interesting if we're going to talk about white evangelicals. But I do just want to take a note to say, hi, Evan, thanks for inviting me. I actually had a really interesting conversation with a colleague of mine called Jonathan O'Donnell, who writes about Christian evangelical spiritual warfare. And we were talking about QAnon, and we were like, yeah, like the things they do are really similar, like the purity culture, for example, right? Expelling anything that might limit or draw them down spiritually. Like that can be other people, that can be certain foodstuffs, you know, that can be like ways of speaking. But both spirituality and evangelicalism both have this kind of purity culture of like expelling the kind of the polluting elements, right? They are also both invested in kind of these notions of like personal relatedness to the divine. So evangelicalism is your relationship with God, right? You hear God talking directly to you. Well, at least that's, you know, Tanya Lerman, for example, wrote a great book about that. And in spirituality, it's all about your personal spiritual path, right? It's you and the divine. You are literally part of the divine, and you just need to get back to yourself, essentially. You know, you are gods and goddesses in your own universe, right? So, you know, there's this same sense of like a very personal, individually based faith. And so when I was talking to my colleague Jonathan about this, we were like, yeah, do you know the other thing that we noticed? They're both like really white religions. And we're like, well, maybe the space where they join is white supremacy, right? They both emerged in the 70s or 80s, you know, during this kind of emergence of neoliberalism, when kind of there were all these social and political policies which are both demonizing and undermining the economic security and the kind of even just the political freedom and civil rights of minorities. And then in the face of neoliberalism, you have these religions emerging that say, yes, you, the individual, are responsible for everything. Pay your own healthcare, you know, get your own job, you know, everything is down to you. You can't trust the state. And this is another reason why they skip the middle level, because the middle level has literally been evacuated in the US. You know, you have barely a welfare state to speak of. And the reason that got evacuated was because there was a great discomfort about expanding public services when the public included people who weren't white. You know, so the space they both inhabit is white supremacy.
So, I wish we'd gotten to that at the start of the Q&A instead of the end left, but yes, yeah, please.
Dr. Crawford, so there's actually a related question on demographics. This is by Robin Veltman. I'm just going to ask this. So I'm curious what your impression of the demographics of contemporary New Agers are young people also drawn to this movement? If so, are young New Agers any more racially diverse than their older counterparts from what you saw?
All right, cool. Hi, Robin. I'm really glad you came. So demographically, the New Age is nearly always, at least in the literature, the sociological literature from like the late 90s, early 2000s, it's described as female, white, middle class, right? And my observations, obviously I'm not a sociologist, I don't do demographic counts, but my observations are that women, especially women over the age of 40 who've just been through a divorce, really like spirituality. And now that I'm a white woman that's almost 40, I kind of get it. Like it's really tailored for you and like making you relax and surrounding you with crystals and nice baths and doing yoga. But I would say that's very much on the participant level. When you look at the spokespeople, the teachers, the kind of the gurus and group leaders, they're nearly all male. Yes, the older generation definitely overwhelmingly white. But it does appeal to younger people. There's this sociologist in Britain called Steve Bruce who kind of dismissed the idea that the New Age was a thing and that it was disappearing because only old women were interested in it. But actually, if you look at things like, say, TikTok and Instagram, spirituality is incredibly popular amongst young people, and there is growing involvement with people who are not white. Some of the biggest TikTok stars under the spirituality hashtags are Black. And so I had one, Sedona's a very white town. So I had maybe two interlocutors who were not white. And there was one in particular, his name was Minza. He features in the 3rd chapter about Starseeds. And he told me he was Pleiadian, from the Pleiades. And he actually had a quite moving story of how he grew up in Central California. He was in a predominantly Black town, and then he had to move to a predominantly white town. And he didn't feel like he fit in either after he made that move, because he felt like when he went back to his old neighbors, they saw him as talking white, right? But then when he was amongst the place where he lived, they, used racial slurs against him. They were racist to him. So he said at that age, he started to see himself as an alien because he was neither Black nor white, and he was not a person at all, but an alien. And in a way for him, it was a way of kind of transcending these social categories of race that he found so limiting and so kind of violent. And I think that's the appeal I could see really taking on amongst people of color. But there is a lot in New Age spirituality which I think is quite off-putting, right? For people who aren't white. Just the sheer whiteness of the groups you would be in, for example, and the use of symbols from other cultures, the constant like namaste when no one really knows what namaste means, right? I think if I was Indian, I would find that quite off-putting. But I think the younger generations, especially because of the influence of social media and because they're so less connected with those kind of in-person groups, then there's a much more kind of flexibility and openness for people, new demographics coming into spirituality. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much. We're at 4:33, so we want to respect your time. We weren't able to get to all of the questions, but thank you all so much. The invisible audience, you've been wonderful. and so many thanks.
Me, by the way,
yes.
if you want to ask a question I didn't get to, you can email me, you can follow me on Twitter, you can just send me a message and I will answer you.
Oh, excellent. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been really, really invigorating and fascinating, and we just appreciate it so much, and we hope you have a good rest of your day and week. So,
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.